When people think about ancient wars, they imagine glory. They imagine disciplined soldiers marching in perfect formations, shining armor reflecting the sun, heroic speeches before battle, and decisive clashes that ended quickly and cleanly. History books, movies, and games have taught us to see ancient warfare as something almost noble, a test of courage, honor, and strength. But this image is deeply misleading, because ancient wars were not fought with glory. They were fought with hunger, exhaustion, fear, disease, and desperation. And for most soldiers, survival mattered far more than honor ever did. An ancient battlefield was not a place of elegance or strategy as we imagine it today. It was loud, chaotic, confusing, and terrifying. Thousands of men stood packed together, unable to see more than a few meters ahead. Dust filled the air. Screams echoed constantly, not only from the wounded, but from men overwhelmed by fear. Commands were lost in the noise. Formation broke easily. And once order collapsed, battle turned into something far more primitive, a brutal struggle to stay alive for just one more minute. Most soldiers were not elite warriors. They were farmers, laborers, craftsmen, ordinary men pulled from their lives and thrown into war. Many had minimal training. Some had never held a weapon before. They carried gear that was heavy, uncomfortable, and often poorly made. Their armor, if they had any at all, was hot and restrictive. Their weapons dulled, bent, or broke. And when something failed, a shield strap snapping, a spear splintering, a sandal tearing, there was no replacement. There was only improvisation or death. Food was never guaranteed. Armies marched on empty stomachs more often than we like to admit. Supply lines were fragile, slow, and easy to disrupt. Soldiers survived on basic rations: grain, dried meat, watered-down wine. Clean water was rare. Disease spread quickly. Dysentery, infections, and dehydration killed more men than enemy weapons ever did. And once an army ran out of supplies, the war was already lost, even if no battle had been fought yet. Armor did not make soldiers invincible. It made them tired. Bronze, iron, leather, all of it added weight. Under the sun, armor became an oven. Breathing grew heavy. Muscles burned. Fatigue slowed reaction time. And a slow soldier was a dead soldier. Many warriors removed pieces of their own protection just to keep moving, fully aware that one exposed strike could end their life. Weapons, too, were far less glamorous than we imagine. Swords were expensive and rare. Spears and simple shields dominated the battlefield because they were cheap, effective, and easy to replace. Combat was not about elegant swordplay. It was about stabbing, pushing, holding ground, and not breaking formation. When formations failed, death followed quickly. Panic spread faster than courage, and once fear took control, even the strongest armies collapsed. Ancient war was not decided in a single heroic moment. It was decided slowly, by logistics, by morale, by weather, by disease, and by exhaustion. Victories often came not because one side was braver, but because the other side was hungrier, weaker, and more afraid. Empires were built not only by great generals, but by supply wagons, roads, and the ability to keep men fed long enough to keep fighting. This is the side of ancient warfare that is rarely shown, the side without romance, without glory, without clean victories. In this video, we will strip away the myths and confront the reality of how ancient wars were really fought. Through weapons that failed, armor that exhausted, logistics that decided fate, and soldiers who fought not for honor, but because survival left them no other choice. As weapons defined survival in ancient wars, but not in the way we often imagine. The battlefield was not dominated by swords clashing in elegant duels. In reality, the most important weapon of ancient warfare was the spear. Cheap to produce, easy to use, and devastating in formation. The spear allowed armies to project force without requiring years of training. A sharp point, a wooden shaft, and discipline. That was enough to kill. Swords were sidearms, backups, symbols of status more than tools of mass warfare. Most soldiers would spend entire battles never drawing their sword at all, relying instead on thrusting spears forward again and again, hoping the man in front of them fell before they did. Weapons were not reliable. Metal quality varied greatly. Blades bent, Spearheads loosened, shields cracked under repeated impact. There was no standardized manufacturing, no guarantee that two weapons were equal. A soldier might enter battle with equipment that had already been repaired multiple times, weakened by rust, moisture, and use. And once a weapon failed, there was no quartermaster handing out replacements. Soldiers grabbed whatever they could find, fallen weapons, broken shields, even rocks. War rewarded adaptability, not perfection. Shields were often more important than armor. A shield was not just protection, it was life itself. It absorbed blows, deflected missiles, and created a moving wall between a soldier and death. Losing a shield meant exposure. It meant panic. Many ancient armies punished soldiers more severely for losing a shield than for retreating, because a shield protected not only the individual, but the entire formation. One gap could unravel everything. Armor, despite popular belief, was not universal. Only wealthier soldiers could afford full protection. Many fought wearing nothing more than padded clothing or leather. Even metal armor varied widely. Bronze cuirasses, chainmail, iron helmets, each with its own drawbacks. Armor reduced mobility, increased heat exhaustion, and drained energy quickly. Marching for hours under the sun with armor already pushed soldiers to their limits before battle even began. By the time fighting started, many were already exhausted. Movement was slow. Contrary to cinematic portrayals, ancient armies did not sprint across battlefields. Running meant breaking formation, and breaking formation meant death. Battles were slow advances, cautious steps forward, shields pressed together, weapons extended. Every step required coordination. Fear grew with every meter. The enemy was close enough to smell, close enough to hear breathing, close enough to see eyes filled with the same terror. Missile weapons, arrows, javelins, slings added another layer of fear. A soldier could die without ever seeing the person who killed him. Arrows fell from the sky unpredictably. Slings crushed bones beneath armor. Javelins disrupted shields and formations before melee even began. These weapons were not meant to kill everyone outright, but to weaken, disorganize, and terrify. Fear was a weapon, and ancient armies understood this well. But no army could fight without supplies, and logistics, more than courage or tactics, decided the fate of wars. Ancient armies moved slowly because they were tethered to food, water, and animals. Grain was heavy, meat spoiled. Water sources dictated routes. An army could not simply march wherever it wanted. It had to follow rivers, roads, and farmland. When supply lines stretched too far, starvation followed quickly. Foraging was common, but dangerous. Soldiers scattered to steal food from nearby villages, exposing themselves to ambush. This bred resentment among civilians and resistance behind enemy lines. Armies that lingered too long in one place stripped the land bare, leaving nothing for themselves or anyone else. Hunger weakened discipline. Desperation bred cruelty. War consumed everything around it. Weather played a brutal role. Rain turned roads into mud. Heat killed silently through dehydration. Cold numbed hands and slowed reactions. Armor rusted. Bowstrings snapped. Campaigns failed not because of enemy strength, but because nature made fighting impossible. Many armies retreated without ever engaging in battle, defeated by conditions they could not control. And then there was morale, the invisible force that decided when armies collapsed. Soldiers did not fight to the last man. When fear outweighed discipline, formations broke. Once retreat began, slaughter followed. Ancient battles were often decided not when one side was destroyed, but when one side lost the will to continue. Panic spread faster than any command could stop it. This was the true nature of ancient warfare. Not heroic charges, not clean victories, but slow, grinding pressure, physical, mental, and logistical, pushing ordinary men beyond their limits. And this was only the beginning, because even after the battle ended, the suffering did not. When the battle finally ended, survival did not mean safety. In many ways, the most dangerous part of ancient warfare began after the fighting stopped. The battlefield was left covered with bodies, broken weapons, shattered shields, and wounded men crying for help. There were no organized medical units, no sterilized instruments, No real understanding of infection. A wound that did not kill a soldier during the battle often killed him days later. Cuts festered. Bones shattered by slings never healed correctly. Simple puncture wounds turned black and swollen. Fever spread quickly, and many soldiers begged to die rather than endure what followed. Medical treatment, when available, was crude and brutal. Surgeons relied on knives, saws, fire, and alcohol. Pain relief was minimal or non-existent. Amputations were performed to prevent gangrene, often without anesthesia. Survival depended less on skill and more on luck, physical resilience, and the body's ability to endure shock. Soldiers who could no longer fight were often abandoned, left behind during marches, or quietly killed to avoid slowing the army down. War had no patience for weakness. The psychological toll was immense. Ancient soldiers had no language for trauma, but they lived with it constantly. Nightmares, panic, trembling, and emotional numbness followed men long after battles ended. There was no rest, no recovery period, no concept of mental health. Armies marched again, fought again, and expected men to perform as if nothing had happened. Many broke under this pressure, deserting when possible, or losing the ability to function entirely. Discipline was enforced harshly because fear was the only thing stronger than terror of the enemy. Between battles, life in an army was monotonous, exhausting, and degrading. Soldiers slept on the ground, exposed to rain, cold, insects, and disease. Hygiene was almost non-existent. Latrines were shallow pits, parasites spread quickly, food was repetitive and barely sufficient. Meat was a luxury, hunger was constant. Soldiers marched for days carrying heavy loads, only to build camps, stand guard, and prepare for fighting that might never come. Fatigue accumulated endlessly, wearing men down long before they ever saw the enemy. Commanders understood that control mattered more than inspiration. Ancient armies relied on strict discipline, routine, and punishment to function. Orders were simple because complexity collapsed under pressure. Drills were repetitive because muscle memory was the only thing that survived fear. Soldiers were trained to obey without thinking, because thinking took time, and time meant death. Yet even the best discipline could fail when hunger, exhaustion, and terror combined. Communication during war was extremely limited. There were no radios, no instant signals. Commands were shouted, signaled with flags, horns, or drums, often misunderstood or ignored in the chaos. Once battle began, generals lost control quickly. What happened on one flank might be completely unknown to the other. Victory and defeat were often accidents, shaped by confusion more than intent. Civilians suffered alongside soldiers. Ancient wars did not spare populations. Armies lived off the land, burning crops, killing livestock, and destroying villages. This was not cruelty for its own sake, but survival strategy. Starving the enemy meant shortening the war. Yet the result was famine, displacement, and generations of resentment. For those caught between armies, survival depended on invisibility or submission. There were no safe zones. Even victorious armies paid a terrible price. Losses were permanent. Equipment had to be replaced. Veterans carried injuries that limited their ability to work or fight again. Societies lost labor, fathers, sons, and stability. Wars reshaped economies, demographics, and cultures long after the last battle ended. Empires expanded, but at immense human cost. Ancient warfare was not a contest of heroes. It was a system, inefficient, brutal, and relentless, that consumed people and resources until one side could no longer endure the pressure. Glory was a story told later by survivors and rulers. Reality was something far darker, experienced only by those who stood in the dust, gripping a weapon, hoping the man in front of them would fall first. And understanding this reality matters, because ancient wars were not primitive versions of modern conflicts. They were wars in their own right, governed by the same fundamental forces that still shape warfare today: logistics, morale, fear, endurance, and the fragile limits of the human body. This is how ancient wars were really fought. But to truly understand ancient warfare, we must step even further back. Before the armies marched, before weapons were raised, before blood was spilled, Ancient wars began long before the battlefield. They began with preparation, mobilization, and the slow, grinding process of turning a society toward violence. Raising an army was itself an enormous burden. Farmers were taken from their fields, craftsmen from their workshops. Crops went unharvested. Families were left without providers. Every campaign weakened the very society it was meant to protect or expand. Training was inconsistent and deeply unequal. Elite units received structured drills, but the majority of soldiers learned through repetition and survival. Many men were taught only the basics: how to hold formation, how to thrust forward, how not to panic when the man beside them fell. There was little room for individual skill. Ancient warfare rewarded cohesion, not heroics. A brave man who broke formation endangered everyone around him. Cowardice was punished not because it was immoral, but because it was contagious. Fear was omnipresent. Soldiers feared death, injury, humiliation, punishment, and abandonment. They feared the enemy, but they also feared their own commanders. Discipline was enforced through beatings, executions, and collective punishment. Some armies practiced decimation, killing 1 in every 10 men to restore order. These measures were not symbolic. They were necessary to keep armies from dissolving under stress. Without fear of punishment, many soldiers would simply refuse to fight. Religion played a powerful role in sustaining morale. Gods were invoked before battles. Sacrifices were made. Omens were interpreted obsessively. Victory was seen as divine favor, defeat as divine punishment. This belief gave meaning to suffering and loss, but it also added pressure. Soldiers believed they were not only fighting enemies, but fate itself. A bad omen could weaken an army before battle even began. Time itself was an enemy. Ancient campaigns were seasonal. Armies could not fight year-round. Harvest dictated movement. Winter halted operations. Delays were dangerous. Every extra day consumed supplies, spread disease, and eroded morale. Commanders were constantly racing against hunger, weather, and exhaustion. Many battles were fought not because they were strategically ideal, but because armies could not afford to wait any longer. When two armies finally met, the decision to fight was often reluctant. Battles were risky. Even victory could cripple an army beyond recovery. Casualties were irreplaceable. Veterans were invaluable. Losing them weakened future campaigns. As a result, many ancient wars were wars of maneuver, intimidation, and attrition rather than constant combat. Sieges were preferred because they reduced risk, starved the enemy instead of facing them head-on. But sieges were slow, brutal, and devastating for civilians trapped inside. Siege warfare revealed the ugliest aspects of ancient conflict. Starvation, disease, cannibalism, and desperation were common. Defenders ate animals, leather, even the dead. Attackers waited, suffering their own shortages and illnesses. When cities finally fell, restraint was rare. Mass killings, enslavement, and destruction followed, not out of cruelty alone, but as deterrence. Mercy encouraged resistance elsewhere. Terror shortened wars. Victory did not guarantee peace. Conquered territories required garrisons, administration, and constant suppression. Rebellions were frequent. Occupation drained resources. Soldiers stationed far from home lived hard lives, isolated and resented. Violence became routine. War blurred into governance. Empires survived not by ending war, but by managing it continuously. Over time, warfare reshaped societies. Technology improved slowly. Tactics evolved painfully. Lessons were written in blood. Armies learned what worked only by failing repeatedly. There was no clean progress, no steady improvement, only adaptation driven by survival. Every innovation created new problems. Better armor meant heavier loads. Stronger weapons meant deadlier wounds. Larger armies meant greater logistical strain. And yet, despite all this suffering, ancient wars continued. Not because people were ignorant of the cost, but because power, security, and survival demanded it. War was not an anomaly. It was a condition of the ancient world. States that could not fight effectively did not survive. Peace was temporary. Violence was structural. Understanding ancient warfare requires abandoning modern assumptions. There were no clean lines between civilian and soldier, between war and peace, between victory and defeat. Everything was connected. War shaped lives from birth to death. It determined where people lived, what they ate, and whether they survived at all. This is why ancient wars must be understood not as stories of heroes, but as systems of pressure applied to human bodies and societies until something broke. And almost always something did. And as we continue deeper into this reality, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Ancient wars were not fought by legends. They were fought by exhausted, frightened humans, just like us, trapped in circumstances they did not choose, trying to endure forces far greater than themselves. As wars dragged on, the distinction between soldier and survivor became increasingly blurred. Many men who marched into battle were no longer fighting for victory, ideology, or even loyalty to a ruler. They were fighting to stay alive long enough to see the next sunrise. Ancient armies were not composed of endless reserves. Every loss mattered. Every dead man weakened the formation, slowed the march, and increased the burden on those who remained. Over time, armies became smaller, more desperate, and more dangerous. Desertion was common despite the risks. Men slipped away at night, hid among civilians, or surrendered to the enemy when possible. Commanders knew this and ruled through fear. Punishments were public and severe. Executions were carried out in front of entire units to remind soldiers of the cost of disobedience. But even fear had limits. When hunger, exhaustion, and hopelessness converged, discipline collapsed. No command could hold an army together forever. Veterans were both respected and feared. They carried scars, physical and psychological, that marked them as survivors. Their presence stabilized formations, but their injuries limited mobility. Many could no longer fight effectively, yet were forced to continue because replacements were scarce. Ancient warfare had no concept of rotation or recovery. A soldier fought until he died, deserted, or became too broken to stand. Equipment degraded over time, armor dented and cracked, helmets lost padding, shields became waterlogged and heavy. Repair was constant but imperfect. Supplies meant for fighting were consumed simply to maintain basic functionality. A poorly maintained army was a dead army, yet maintenance required time and resources that were always in short supply. Leadership mattered, but not in the way modern narratives suggest. Charismatic speeches rarely changed outcomes. What mattered was consistency. A commander who fed his troops, avoided unnecessary battles, and managed supplies effectively was more valuable than a brilliant tactician who chased glory. Many famous defeats were the result of arrogance, impatience, or failure to respect logistical limits. Intelligence was unreliable. Information traveled slowly and was often wrong. Scouts disappeared. Messengers were captured or killed. Decisions were made with incomplete or outdated knowledge. Armies marched into ambushes not because commanders were foolish, but because uncertainty was unavoidable. War was fought in a fog far thicker than any smoke on the battlefield. Alliances were fragile. Ancient politics shifted constantly. Former allies became enemies overnight. Mercenaries changed sides when payment failed. Loyalty was transactional. Trust was rare. Armies often fought alongside men they barely knew, who spoke different languages and followed different customs. Coordination suffered. Tension simmered. Unity was fragile. When wars ended, they rarely ended cleanly. Treaties were temporary. Borders were unstable. Victors imposed terms that bred resentment and future rebellion. Defeated populations were taxed, enslaved, or displaced. Violence lingered long after armies withdrew. War did not conclude, it faded, leaving scars that shaped generations. Memory itself became a weapon. Rulers rewrote conflicts to justify power. Defeats were minimized, victories exaggerated. Suffering was forgotten or repackaged as necessary sacrifice. The reality of ancient warfare survived only in fragments. Scars on bones, ruined cities, and accounts written long after the fact by those who benefited most from war. And yet, beneath all the myth-making, the pattern remains clear. Ancient wars were sustained by systems that exploited human endurance until it failed. Weapons and armor mattered, but they were secondary to supply, morale, and control. Victory belonged not to the strongest, but to those who could endure longer under unbearable conditions. This is the final truth of ancient warfare. It was not about conquest alone. It was about survival within a world where violence was constant, resources were limited, and collapse was always close. Understanding this reality strips away the fantasy and reveals something far more unsettling. Ancient wars were not fought to create legends. Legends were created afterward to make sense of the suffering. And once that illusion is gone, what remains is a clear, uncomfortable understanding of how wars, then and now, are truly fought. Once we remove the myths, what remains is a pattern that repeats across civilizations, cultures, and centuries. Ancient warfare followed the same underlying logic everywhere, regardless of whether the soldiers fought in Greece, Rome, Persia, China, or the steppes of Central Asia. Different weapons, different armor, different gods, but the same human limits, the same hunger, the same fear, the same exhaustion, and the same brutal truth. Wars were won not by brilliance alone, but by the ability to sustain pressure longer than the enemy could endure it. Consider the march itself, often overlooked and underestimated. Marching was warfare before warfare. Soldiers walked dozens of kilometers carrying weapons, armor, food, tools, and personal belongings. Feet blistered and bled, shoes fell apart, knees failed. Men collapsed from heat or cold and were left behind. Every step drained strength that would be needed later in battle. By the time armies arrived at their destination, they were already worn down, already diminished. A battle fought after a long march was rarely fair, and commanders knew this. Timing mattered as much as terrain. Terrain dictated everything: hills, forests, rivers, swamps. These were not background details, but deciding factors. Heavy infantry struggled in uneven ground. Cavalry became useless in forests or mud. Narrow passes turned numbers into liabilities. Many famous battles were decided not by superior soldiers, but by where and when fighting occurred. A poorly chosen battlefield could destroy even the strongest army, and once committed, retreat was often impossible without catastrophic losses. Encounters between armies were often tense standoffs rather than immediate clashes. Lines formed. Soldiers stared at one another, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. Fear built slowly. Muscles tightened. Men wondered who would advance first. The psychological strain was immense. When fighting finally began, it exploded not from confidence, but from accumulated tension, snapping all at once. Death was rarely instantaneous. Many wounds were slow and agonizing. A spear thrust that did not hit a vital organ could leave a man bleeding internally for hours. Crushing blows broke bones without killing, trapping soldiers on the ground where they were trampled by their own comrades. There was no mercy for the fallen during battle. Stopping meant dying. Survival required moving forward, no matter what lay underfoot. Sound shaped the battlefield as much as sight. The clash of metal, the cracking of wood, the screams of the wounded, the shouted commands, all merged into a constant roar. Hearing failed. Orientation failed. Soldiers fought in a sensory overload that stripped away rational thought. Training reduced this chaos, but never eliminated it. Even veterans were overwhelmed. Courage was not the absence of fear, it was functioning despite it. Victory often came suddenly. One side wavered. A gap opened. A unit fled. Panic spread. What had been a controlled struggle instantly became a massacre. Retreating soldiers were cut down from behind. Discipline vanished. Formations dissolved. Most casualties occurred during these moments, not during the initial clash. Ancient battles were decided quickly once morale broke, but the killing continued long after resistance ended. Afterward came looting. Soldiers stripped the dead of weapons, armor, clothing, and anything of value. This was not optional. Pay was irregular. Loot supplemented survival. Bodies were left exposed. Burial was rare and hurried. The battlefield became silent, broken only by the wounded and scavengers. War moved on, leaving devastation behind. And yet armies marched again. Survivors regrouped. Replacements were gathered. Weapons were repaired. Stories were told. Losses were rationalized. The cycle continued because ancient societies were built around it. States rose by mastering war. They survived by institutionalizing it. Peace was fragile because the systems that supported war never truly disappeared. What makes ancient warfare unsettling is not how different it was from modern war, but how similar it remains in its fundamentals. Technology changes, scale changes, speed changes, but the human experience, pressure, fear, exhaustion, loss, remains constant. Ancient soldiers endured what they did because they had no alternative. Their world offered no escape from violence, only different ways to endure it. This understanding reframes everything. It forces us to see ancient wars not as distant, abstract events, but as lived experiences endured by real people with fragile bodies and limited choices. It strips away spectacle and replaces it with reality. And that reality is this: ancient wars were not fought by monsters or legends. They were fought by ordinary humans trapped inside systems that demanded suffering as the price of survival. Every ancient empire was built on the same foundation: human endurance pushed to its breaking point. Behind every victory stood thousands of lives permanently altered or erased. War did not end when armies stopped fighting. It continued in homes left empty, in fields left untended, in children who grew up without fathers, and in societies that normalized violence as part of daily life. The cost of ancient warfare was not limited to soldiers. It spread outward, touching everyone. Families were the first casualties. Men left for war and never returned, or returned broken beyond recognition. Widows were common. Orphans were everywhere. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing but instability. In many societies, loss became routine. Mourning had to be brief because survival demanded it. Grief was carried silently, passed down rather than resolved. Enslavement was one of the most widespread outcomes of ancient war. Defeated populations were not simply conquered, they were absorbed as labor, stripped of identity and freedom. Men, women, and children were marched away, sold, or forced into service. This was not an exception, it was a system. Ancient economies depended on the constant influx of enslaved people produced by warfare. Victory meant profit. Defeat meant dehumanization. Cities that fell rarely recovered fully. Destruction erased infrastructure, knowledge, and culture. Skilled workers were killed or displaced. Trade collapsed. Hunger followed. Even decades later, scars remained visible in ruined walls and empty districts. Empires expanded, but stability weakened beneath the surface. Power grew wider, not deeper. War reshaped identity. Societies defined themselves by enemies, victories, and trauma. Honor codes emerged not to glorify violence, but to make it bearable. Rituals, monuments, and legends softened the memory of suffering. History became selective. Pain was edited out. What remained was a narrative that justified future wars by sanitizing past ones. For soldiers who survived, there was no real return to normal life. Injuries limited work. Trauma haunted silence. Many could not reintegrate. Violence had trained them for war, not peace. Some became mercenaries. Others lived on the margins. Ancient societies had no space for healing, only for use. And yet, despite everything, war continued. Not because people were blind to its cost, but because power demanded it. States that refused to fight were absorbed by those who did not hesitate. Survival favored those who mastered violence more efficiently than their rivals. Ancient warfare was not driven by hatred alone, but by systemic necessity. This is why ancient wars must be understood as more than battles. They were engines that consumed populations to maintain dominance. Weapons, armor, and tactics were tools, but the true fuel was human life, and that fuel was considered renewable. When we look back at ancient warfare, distance makes it easier to romanticize. Time turns suffering into spectacle. But when stripped of myth, what remains is deeply familiar: hunger, fear, loss, endurance. These are not ancient experiences. They are human ones. Ancient wars were not fought by heroes carved in stone. They were fought by ordinary people trapped inside systems that rewarded violence and punished weakness. Understanding this does not diminish history, it clarifies it. And perhaps that is the most important lesson. War does not need monsters to exist. It only needs structures that make suffering normal and survival conditional. That is how ancient wars were really fought.